In 1973, NBC got a story that would have put America's best detective up against a killer who had no reason to kill. Bosses at the network got scared and locked it up. They said it was too dark to watch TV. They said the people would not be ready. And the real reason this Columbo show was hidden for 50 years was much worse. We're going to show what they tried to hide today. In early 1960, there was a writer's strike in Hollywood, which stopped everything. Two screenwriters who were having a hard time, Richard Levinson and William Link, were trying to make ends meet. But they didn't wait it out. Instead, they found a sneaky way around it. They found out that the strike rules didn't cover live TV, so they went for it. For NBC's new live color show, The Chevy Story Show, they wrote a murder story called Enough Rope. They were in a hurry, and even lied to their own agent to get it sold. But something amazing was born in that jumbled writing. Lieutenant Columbo, a scruffy and strange detective. They had no idea that this last-ditch effort would become famous all over the world. Character wasn't even completely unique. The idea came from Porfiry Petrovich, the detective in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. A soft-spoken guy who seemed harmless but was really smart. That's what they liked about Columbo. For some reason, they chose to show the killer right at the start, instead of at the end, like most stories do. Seeing how Columbo, with all his oddities and questions, would slowly trap them, was what made the scene exciting. People loved it because it was smart, new, and psychological. It wasn't even Peter Falk who played the first Columbo. The part was played by Bert Freed in a live show on July 31, 1960. The quiet, careful work he did was good, but the real magic wasn't coming for years. After 2 years, the story was turned into a play called Prescription Murder. Thomas Mitchell played Columbo in the play. The audience liked it, even if it didn't make it to Broadway. Mitchell's last part before he died would be that sad one. But 1968 was a big year for change. The TV show Prescription Murder is now a movie on NBC. And Peter Falk was chosen this time. He wasn't the first choice. He was the best choice for the part, even though Lee J. Cobb and Bing Crosby both said no. Falk gave Columbo something new, a strange charm that was paired with a laser-like focus. He looked pretty clean-cut in that first movie. His suit was pressed, and his hair was neat. The well-known jacket did, however, make its appearance, and stayed around forever. That coat of rain. It was only $15 when Falk bought it himself in New York during a storm. He wore it in the movie, and did not stop. It turned out to be more than just a coat. In fact, a high-end Spanish company made it. But Falk thought it was a great look. He began to bring his own clothes to work. The clothes, the shoes, and even the car. He chose that dirty old Peugeot on his own. All of this helped make the agent seem real, not like he or she was dressed up by a fashion team. The way Falk played Columbo made him even more interesting. He wasn't just pretending, he was being sneaky. It worked when Falk made up lines on the spot, got distracted in the middle of a scene, and threw off the players who were meant to be guilty. They looked tense and annoyed, just like their roles called for. He could show you a shopping list instead of proof, or ask to borrow a pencil for no reason. It wasn't a mistake, these were tricks. People in the crowd knew what was going on, which made Columbo even more fun to watch. There's also the line, "One more thing." What was that phrase? It wasn't part of a clever plan. They both said that they only added it because they didn't want to retype a scene that was too short. Columbo was told to say it again when he came back into the room. That was the start of TV's most famous secret agent move. What began as a quick fix turned into a signature move that usually meant the killer was going to die. Columbo's character was so unique that no one knew what his name was. People never really knew his first name all those years. Frank Columbo was sometimes shown on a hazy tag, but the people who made him said they never gave him a first name. They wished it would stay that way. Fred Worth, a trivia writer, made up Philip Columbo as a fake fact to catch people who were copying him. When Trivial Chase fell for it, he sued them. Even though he lost, the story lived on. Everyone just called him Lieutenant, even at the wedding of Columbo's nephew. It would be weird if your family didn't even call you by your first name. In the background, the casting process was just as tough. The killers in each show were played by guest stars, and the cast often looked at dozens of players for those roles. It was even thought that Orson Welles and Peter Sellers might be good fits for one part. They couldn't take the Sellers' high prices. Falk himself turned down some ideas. He turned down Danny Kaye without saying why. When Columbo was first being planned in 1971, NBC officials weren't sure if it would work. In fact, they were scared. Back then, there were rules about TV. People might have switched channels if the hero didn't show up right away. But Richard Levinson and William Link, who made Columbo, didn't care about the rules. People in the theater had to wait for Columbo for almost 30 minutes. That length of time had never been seen before, and officials called it the longest stage wait in the history of TV. They were afraid that people would get bored and leave. But what happened next flipped the whole mystery genre on its head. While most shows try to figure out who did it, this one told you right away who the killer was. That was the catch. You saw the murder happen. You saw how carefully the plan was put together, and then you took a step back to see how that plan would slowly fall apart, because of the awkward detective. When people found out who the killer was, they thought the tension would go away, but it didn't. It made everything worse. He started to play a game about how to catch them instead of if he would. Columbo also didn't use guns or follow cars. He was polite, used common sense, and had an eye for small things, like a wine glass smudge, or a setting that was too low. There was something else, though, that made Columbo so strong. It had to do with class. He wasn't wealthy. He always smoked cheap cigars, wore the same worn coat, and talked about his wife. His car was in bad shape. He went after surgeons, stars, CEOs, generals, and other important people who thought they would never get caught. They were never treated like they were important by Columbo. In fact, he often made them feel bad. To see how they would respond, he would ask how much their fancy picture cost, or say that his wife had something similar at home. Columbo made sure that the rich didn't think they were safe, because the show showed them in a quiet way. NBC tried to step in at one point. They told the people who made it to change the style after only a few shows. They asked the team to put Columbo in the story earlier and in a more standard way, but they said no. Aside from Falk, Levinson, Link, and the director William Finnerman, all stuck to their guns. They said they would quit before making changes to the show's subject. It was very risky, but it paid off. People loved it. Ratings went up, and the bosses began to back down. When it first aired on September 15, 1971, Columbo was not like any other show. Along with other police shows, it was shown on NBC as part of their mystery movie run, but it became a hit very quickly. The act by Peter Falk was a big part of that. An Emmy was given to him that season. He won 4 more awards and a Golden Globe for the part over the years. Columbo will always be remembered for his messy charm and careful delivery. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't needed to be. Everything would fall apart for the killer as soon as he asked one more question. Because the show was on NBC and rotated, episodes were sometimes 90 minutes long. This gave the writers more time to build drama and character. Columbo felt more like a movie than a TV show, because it had that much space. It did so well that NBC moved the shows to Sunday nights, where they did even better in the ratings. Columbo was no longer just a hit. He was now a prime-time host. Most people didn't think the show would go so far. It left the United States, all over the world. It had fans all over the world, because it was shown in 44 countries. A figure of Columbo was made by fans in Hungary. The show's end made people in Romania so angry that Peter Falk had to record a message to calm them down and say that it wasn't banned, it was just over. Even after decades, the BBC still said it was timeless. Columbo's quiet determination, his sense of right and wrong, and the pleasure he got from bringing down cocky crooks were things that everyone cared about. Columbo made it an honor for guest stars to catch killers. A lot of well-known stars wanted to play the killer. It was done 3 times by Jack Cassidy. It was done twice by William Shatner. For his roles, Patrick McGoohan won Emmys. In one show, Martin Landau, Roger Culp, Leonard Nimoy, and even Robert Culp played twin killers. There was a stage for shows. Great people were drawn to the show even behind the scenes. Steven Spielberg directed the first normal show when he was 24 years old. Peter Falk knew right away that this person was too good for Columbo. Something strange took place in Hollywood in the summer of 1973. As a rising director, Brian De Palma chose to write an episode for Columbo, even though he really doesn't like TV. This was the same De Palma who had just put out Sisters, a dark movie that showed how much he liked Hitchcock-style stories. He was so inspired by Columbo, though, that he sent in a story with his friend Jay Cox, who is a well-known film critic. As if they were in on a secret joke, they even gave Jay a fake name, Joseph P. Gillis from Sunset Boulevard. Even stranger was the fact that it all happened during a writer's strike, when the show really needed new episodes. When De Palma crossed into a world he didn't like, he looked down on TV, because this messy mystery show didn't seem right to him. They made up a crazy story. A director named Quentin Lee, who clearly drew inspiration from real people like Truman Capote, kills a talk show host and records the whole thing. But this wasn't just a murder, it made a point. Lee wanted to show that a crime with no reason could be the best kind of crime. He picks someone off a list of famous people in his building with a dart, because he thinks they are cheap and fake. He calls them a public zircon, which means fake diamond. He doesn't think they're worth much. When he chooses to make a documentary about it and puts Columbo in it without the detective knowing, his already crazy plan gets even stranger. It quickly turns meta. 3 students are even following Columbo with cameras. One of them is called Spielberg, which is a nod to the real Spielberg, who directed an early episode of the show. But it wasn't a good time for De Palma. Producers were rushing because the strike had pushed the show's start date back. A second draft, Double Exposure by Stephen J. Cannell, was also sent in during the strike. The movie was easier to make, and had a bad guy who killed people with hidden pictures. A cool idea, but it would be easier to carry out when time is limited. De Palma's writing was trickier to read because it had more layers of story and visual effects. The makers liked it, maybe even more than some of the episodes they made, but they didn't have the time or money to make it happen. It was later used to make other shows, like the episode Mind Over Mayhem, which used the idea of a film student. That version even had a character named Steven Spielberg. The name was spelled a little differently, but it was clear that it was a reference to what De Palma had written. The real trouble was the tone. Columbo's killers generally had clear selfish reasons for killing: cash, vengeance, and power. That wasn't important to De Palma's bad guy. As an artistic project, he wanted to make a point of killing someone. People thought of Hitchcock's Robe, where the killers were sure they were smarter than everyone else. That wasn't what Columbo was about, though. It's likely that the makers thought viewers wouldn't connect with a character who was so cold and strange. Watching people through cameras and blurring the line between truth and performance are some of De Palma's most famous themes. They were strong, but they didn't fit with the show's cozy Sunday evening vibe. Some people even thought about John Lithgow as the lead, but they were afraid that he was too big and scary for TV at the time. The show was put on hold in the end. Columbo had a plan that worked, even though he was under a lot of stress from work and artistic differences. At the start, the killer is shown. It's never about who did it, it's always about how Columbo will catch them. He was slow, smart, and polite, and he always knew what was going on. But then there was No Time to Die in 1992, and everything changed. At first, there was no murder, and the investigation was not calm. Instead, there was chaos, screams, chloroform, and a frightening kidnapping while the couple was on their honeymoon. It seemed more like a scary movie than an episode of Columbo. Columbo didn't use quiet reasoning. Instead, he worked with a police unit, carry a gun, and race against the clock. Gunfire finished the last few seconds. Fans of Columbo had never heard of anything like it. Some people said it was bold. A lot of people said it was the worst show ever. It wasn't the only time the show went in a strange direction, though. There was death, smoke, and clouds when Columbo came back in 1989, after being gone for 11 years. And show with a Hollywood theme that went too far with the ridiculousness. The bad guy was a young, flashy movie director who seemed more like a parody of Steven Spielberg than a real threat. Columbo slowly moving on a waterbed for more than 10 minutes in a single scene. The big surprise was when police cops in costumes came out in a big way. It looked like a stage show, with lights and music. It seemed more like a joke than a puzzle. Still, some fans later supported it, because it was better than what came after in the recovery years. Things got even stranger that year, with a death and a self-portrait. Instead of putting together information, Columbo solved the case by figuring out what the victim's strange dreams meant. It was possible to see pocket watches in teacups, meat in a sink, and even a French uncle that meant monocle. The killer was an artist who was full of himself. Lived with both of his current and past wives, until one of them died. A lot of the story was based on psychology and symbols, but it didn't make much sense. All of a sudden, Columbo knew more than a trained therapist, and the memories that were said to have been pushed down were not real. Even so, the picture he got at the end made an impact that will last, even if the story didn't. When the year 2003 came around, Columbo was looking into raves. Yes, raves. The last episode of the show, Columbo Likes the Nightlife, tried to bring the messy detective into the present day. Instead of cigar smoke and quiet living rooms, there was loud music, bright lights, and a lot of hot dancers. Columbo looked crazy in a feather boa and went into nightclubs. He even picked up a toenail clipping by hand from a toilet. There was a murder, a cover-up, and a newspaper reporter in the story. But what most people remember about the event is how strange it seemed. It was shocking and awkward, but also strangely interesting. Some watchers loved how hard they tried to make him more current. Some people just missed the good old days. Not every mistake was done on purpose to be strange. The movie Blueprint for Murder, which came out in 1972, was Peter Falk's first chance to direct. It was hard to shoot. He was mad at the producers because they gave him a show that took place on a real building site, just to make things harder. Spielberg and Cassavetes were called by Falk for help, and Falk even paid extras himself when the company wouldn't. The outcome was not even. The pace was all over the place, and there was no death shown on screen. First quickly, then slowly. It was strange, even the music they chose. When the same Brahms piece keeps coming up, Falk's acting was also bad. Having to do both jobs wasn't easy, and he never directed another show after that. Most Columbo fans thought that was the end of the road when Peter Falk played the role in Columbo Likes the Nightlife in 2003. But that wasn't the plan behind the scenes. Universal Studios quietly started working on one last episode in 2007. It would have been the 70th and final case. Even though it was first called Hear No Evil, it was quickly changed to Columbo's Last Case to make it clear. No, this wasn't just another puzzle. It was time to say goodbye. Falk was almost 80 years old at the time, but he didn't want to die. He wanted to leave the stage in a good way. One last time in the rough coat that made him famous. It took a lot of work to write a 100-page script that would let him get rid of Columbo in the right way. The time was just right. The figure had not been seen since 1968, which was 40 years ago. The story was just as smart as always. It was about a high-tech murder that was done with sound. It was new, but it still had the psychological turns that the show was known for. First, there was a very small sound that only Columbo could hear. It slowly revealed the killer's plan. To make things even more unique, Larry King played himself in a part in the writing. It was meant to be a funny appearance, like in the old days when stars like Johnny Cash or Janet Leigh just showed up out of the blue. From the very beginning to almost the very end, the show felt like old-school Columbo. It was smart, built up slowly, and was full of small moments that added up to something big. But the project hit a wall. Even though Falk was ready to go and the story was finished, ABC didn't want it, because they had been showing Columbo flicks for years. Why? Falk's age. It was clear to network executives that they didn't want a TV movie with an 80-year-old lead. One of the people who made the choice, Charles Engel, said it didn't matter that Falk had played Columbo into his 70s and still had an audience, or that part of Columbo's charm was that people didn't think much of him. No one could move the networks. Universal tried to get backers from other countries in the hopes that the detective's fame around the world would be enough. But the progress stopped when it didn't have a big US network behind it. The worst blow then came. Falk's health began to get worse in 2007. The people who knew him well started to notice changes after he had some dental work done. His memory began to fade. Not long after that, it was proven. Falk had signs of having Alzheimer's. That year, 2008, the finding was made public. It was clear then what damage had been done. The man who used to play a TV detective who was smarter than everyone else couldn't even remember that he was Columbo. After that, his daughter told the judge that he no longer recognized known faces, including hers. It was clear by 2009 that there would not be a final show. The carefully planned goodbye would never be caught on film. Michael Falk died in 2011. At 83, he died of problems caused by asthma and Alzheimer's, and Columbo died with him. With his rumpled coat and tired look, Peter Falk looked like a detective. But behind that lazy look was a man who took his work more seriously than anyone else. Falk was Columbo, not just a role. He came to set in his own clothes, didn't want to be rushed, and insisted on getting every detail right, no matter what it cost the company. A 10-day shoot could last 2 weeks because Falk would stop in the middle of a scene to change a line or look into why a character did what they did. People who tried to push him would generally feel bad about it. Even people who work for studios knew not to fight. That well-known raincoat, it wasn't from closet, it was his. That mumbling, rambling style was planned out very carefully. Falk made the players guess, which worked because it kept their emotions real. Columbo seemed like someone you knew but you didn't know what made him tick. But Falk wasn't liked by everyone. Danny Kaye's name came up when the makers were looking for people to play parts in the show. Negative reaction. Most people would have jumped at the chance to work with him because he was a big star. But Falk flatly refused. Anyone know the reason? It's the only time he's ever stopped someone from going on the show. Some people think it was because they had worked together in comedy before, and Falk didn't want Columbo to become a joke. Some people think it was just a clash of styles. Falk wouldn't move either way. He put people out if he thought they didn't belong on his show. It's that easy. Falk was fighting for power on set, and the writers were having a different kind of nightmare. Columbo was very different from other police shows because it started with the murder. Because of that trick, writers had to build tension without the ending being a surprise. A lot of people found it tiring. Only 2 of the 60 skilled writers that NBC asked to watch a pilot were interested in writing for the show. That's how hard it was. That's why the writers' room turned into a pressure cooker. They locked themselves in rooms all day to come up with ideas, and sometimes they would grab anyone who walked by to help them fix a plot that was stuck. Lawrence Cohen stopped by to say hello and left with a writing job because he could solve a story problem that no one else could. Things got worse when NBC chose to make the shows 2 hours long to fill up the scripts. Scenes that didn't add anything were added. A lot of people thought the quality began to drop. Then something very strange took place. After being over for decades, Columbo came back with a new generation and caused a big fuss. There were 300% more streams of the show between 2020 and 2023. People who were stuck at home because of the pandemic liked how slow and careful Columbo was moving. And the younger people loved how the show made fun of rich people. Because most of the killers were snobs from the upper class who thought they were safe. They kept coming back to earth with Columbo's worn-out shoes and soft voice. Also, social media was helpful. There were fan mods for Among Us on TikTok, Twitter, and other sites that showed love for the messy detective who always got his man. Then there were memes. All of a sudden, Columbo cuts were everywhere. On Twitter, someone thought of him as a 3-inch tall police officer who solved small crimes. In a spoof video, he looked into Tumblr posts, and fans became crazy about his weird habits. The wife who was never seen. The old Peugeot. That memorable line, and one more thing. He was more well known on the internet than ever before, but he hadn't changed a thing. He was still the very smart and humble man, getting killers caught by being kind and confusing them. Peter Falk held on to that part the whole time. He won 5 Emmys for it, and even after decades, he kept working to make the child better. People of all ages still argue about whether Columbo was just lucky or truly very smart. It could be both. That's what made it beautiful. You never knew for sure if he was messing up or not. You knew what was going on, but he already had you.